because people are complex, that means the solution is going to be complex as well and probably a little messy. But we start with the fact that people live everywhere in wildlands now. There's almost nowhere you can go except wilderness areas where people don't live right on the edge of a national forest or a state forest or tribal lands or, any particular area. So whatever we do out there will affect some community of people somewhere. And we can no longer deny that or to say that we know best and you people just have to go along with us, because that in the past we might have got away with that, but we don't get away with that now. So engaging people early and often is the key.
Welcome to the Forest Overstory with WSU Extension Forestry. The Forest Overstory is a podcast that provides insight and education into the field of forest management, helping landowners to become better stewards of their forest. The Forest Overstory is brought to you by the Society of American Foresters and the Inland Empire Chapter. Welcome, Dave, to the podcast. Welcome to the Forest Overstory. Thanks for coming. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I've had a long career in forest ecology and the study of natural resource science throughout the western United States. That's primarily been as a federal research scientist. I'm now an Emeritus Senior Scientist with the U.S. Forest Service, and I'm also a professor of forest biology at the University of Washington in the Forestry School. So that's allowed me to cover a wide range of topics throughout my career with a focus primarily on fire science and climate change.
There's not a lot of people that you can interview that have a Wikipedia page associated with them. And you have one, and I looked it up, and it actually says you were invited to serve on the board of the IPCC. Did you serve on that?
Yes, I did work with IPCC a number of years ago, and that was quite an interesting experience trying to bring to bear large-scale issues relative to climate change, and not just for the United States and North America, but globally. And so I think that really kind of opened my eyes about different ways of looking at things, different forest ecosystems throughout the world. And my other kind of big picture experience has been working with the National Climate Assessment. I worked with the third and fourth National Climate Assessments, was lead author for the fourth. And this time now that we have National Climate Assessment 5, I'm an author on the forest chapters. So that continued involvement has kept me up to date on some of the bigger issues related to forests and climate change.
I may be wrong, but wasn't your work with the IPCC, is that the same year that they won the Nobel Prize? And are you de facto a Nobel Prize winner?
Yeah, 2007, Al Gore and me, right?
That's right.
Anyway, there were like hundreds of people who were co-recipients of that award, and I was one of them. It was certainly a proud moment, and I think that 2007 report by the IPCC was a watershed moment for the world, because that report got everyone's attention, including in the United States, where at that point in time, climate change was not a particularly high-profile issue, especially at the national level. So that really was a moment at which things started to move, I think, in a more positive direction in terms of taking action.
So before we really get into the meat of today's discussion, I just kind of want to get to know you, Dave. Where are you from originally? Are you from Washington?
I grew up on the south side of Chicago, which might seem like an unlikely place for somebody in natural resource science to come from. But despite the urban blight of a big city, in Cook County, which is where Chicago is, there are a lot of forest preserves, large areas of protected habitat that have been there for over 100 years now. And as a kid, I spent a lot of time roaming around those woods, watching birds, studying trees, doing what a kid does out there, including a lot of things my mother never did know about. But it was a learning opportunity for me. It fed my introversion associated with nature, and it also just kind of kept in mind what the bigger term goal was for my own life and my career was to someday spend more time in the woods and maybe do something professionally related to the outdoors.
I can kind of see where you're coming from, and I think it maybe is a common track where people that grew up in areas where nature was in short supply come to value it that much more and maybe want to protect it, with their career down the line.
And what that experience brought out to me was how important some of those early childhood experiences are for people. And a lot of kids now, when we have an increasingly urbanizing population in the United States, a lot of kids don't have that experience anymore. When I was teaching some of the introductory courses in forest biology at the University of Washington, I would always try to understand what outdoor experiences a lot of the students had. Very infrequently did I have students in that class who came from rural areas. They're almost all from urban areas. Many of these kids, now around 20 years old, had never been camping before. Mm. And here they are learning about biology, some of them very passionate about environmental science, but just didn't have that personal opportunity to get outdoors and experience things. So I think that's something that the broader forest community, natural resource community really needs to keep in mind. Is not just about folks in rural areas, but also folks in urban areas who still have a lot of passion about nature.
Yeah, that's interesting because having lived or currently living in a rural area, Colville, it's not that there's a lack of people that are in the industry that are from rural areas. It just doesn't seem like a lot of them are going maybe through the collegiate academic route. I mean, if you look at the mills, the jobs that are provided through the mills, a lot of the consulting agencies, they hire a lot of local kids, the FFA programs, there's a lot of involvement in it. It just seems like there's kind of this separation in the pathways that people take to get involved and engaged in these careers later on in life.
No, that just having those opportunities and those exposures to different opportunities is critical. And I'm speaking here as a first generation college student. Neither of my parents went to high school. They grew up in the Depression. They were poor. We didn't have an academic background, but yet they provided me, the opportunity to do whatever I wanted to do. And so I did have that grounding there. But there are still many, many people who, if they're not exposed to this at an early age, you never get that vision in your head. Hey, I could go to college. Hey, I could be a professor. I could be a scientist. I could be, some other profession. And it's increasingly important to go to college, even for a couple of years if you can, because it's very competitive. So that's why I'm a great believer in, expanding opportunities for folks in rural areas and lower economic situations, just to give them a chance to see something different in the world.
Were you involved in Scouts or any other youth programs when you were younger that kind of connected you with the outdoors?
Well, I was in Cub Scouts, and so we had some of that. There weren't a whole lot of outstanding camping trips in the Chicago area, unfortunately. And the other thing, I was always involved in sports from the time I was about 8 years old up through high school, and benefited a lot from the mentorship of many coaches and managers and men in our community. I From the time I was 12 years old on, my father had passed, and so having that mentorship of these men who cared about trying to basically expose kids to athletics, teamwork, being outdoors, as opposed to nowadays I might be inside just looking at the computer. So all those things, whether it was sports or actually nature study, had an influence on my connection with the outdoor environment.
So did you have like a teacher either in, middle school or high school, or even a professor in college that really you kind of honed in on forestry specifically, or climate change, or any of the interests that you have now? What was the impetus of that?
I think I found my own way there.
Mm.
From the time I was about 12 years old, I knew I wanted to be a scientist, which may sound kind of weird, but that's what I gravitated to. I didn't know what that meant at the time. And it probably wasn't until I was in a PhD program at the University of Illinois that I actually knew what I wanted to do. And it just took a while to migrate to that path. I got a degree in zoology, I got a degree in botany, then got a degree in forest biology. So I wanted to be I guess I ended up being a generalist. I don't know if that was my original objective, but I'm glad I went that route because it really it's been a good foundation for me. Nowadays, I think there's a tendency to focus on specialization and to get a little bit stovepiped into a particular discipline. But if you're in the forestry business or ecology, there's an expectation that you know a little bit about everything, and that's what I find interesting about the world is there's always something to learn. And so I think that the pathway towards what I ended up doing professionally was uh, partly random and partly purposeful. But I think it would there were a number of doors that opened at different times that allowed me to experience certain things. Had many positive experiences with college professors and classes, but mostly fellow graduate students. We kind of inspired each other, I think, to excellence, and I think that's still true in graduate education.
One of the things that I find interesting about the generalist versus specialist conversation is in ecology, right? Even the word ecology, what's the Greek? Is it a Greek etymological or etymological word? I'm trying to think of my
Oikos.
vocabulary. Oikos, yeah. So of the house, it's this all encompassing word, and I think to actually be a really good ecologist, you have to be a generalist. You have to think about all these different facets, all these different ecosystem services, all these different habitat complexities and variables that are driving things to actually really be capable in this field and make decisions that are going to, be resilient and have good outcomes into the future.
I think that's absolutely true. And I've been grateful to have that generalist background, in retrospect, certainly. Um, you can always look back and say, well, I missed this, I missed that. But I really think, getting your academic training and college courses is one thing. But my first year on the job, I probably learned more than I did the previous 4 years in terms of the opportunity to interact with other scientists and resource managers and to be out in the field in places I had never been before. And I think the biggest challenge is to take that foundation of knowledge that you got and apply it to different places. I've always said that a good ecologist, you could blindfold them, put them on a plane, drop them down, and then they should be able to adapt fairly quickly by using a basic skill set of what they know about soils and plants and water and so forth. And I still think that's true.
Yeah, it's always funny. I'll see pictures of friends and they'll be out hiking somewhere and in the background you can see maybe a couple trees or a shrub or maybe even a hillside. And in the last couple of years of my life, I've gotten really good at being able to identify the region or the state or even sometimes exactly like the city that they'll be in because I can start to pick apart some of those the composition of that area or the plant types.
I do the same thing. It's a fun game. And,
Yeah.
and my wife and I do that all the time with TV shows and movies.
Yeah.
Like one of our favorite shows is NCIS, and they're supposed to be located on the East Coast, and yet I always see scenes that have eucalyptus in them, which
Oh.
means Southern California. So, I mean, that's just kind of playing games, but it is fun to be able to identify with particular locations in terms of what the expectations are for the ecology, the plant species, and so forth of those particular locations.
For the same reason, my wife no longer enjoys watching movies or TV shows with me because I get upset when they say they're in Pennsylvania and they're surrounded by ponderosa pines.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, what was your first job? You said the first time you learned, more in the last 4 years. What was that job?
Yeah, my first job was with the U.S. Forest Service, Pacific Southwest Research Station, located in Riverside, California, which is about 60 miles east of Los Angeles. So here you take a guy who's from the Midwest, who has been on an airplane only one time before, and you launch him down to Southern California. So that was, it was both challenging and exciting at the same time. But my job at that time was to work with a team developing a large-scale framework for evaluating the effects of wildfire on natural resources and especially the economics of wildfire. So I was the only biologist on the team. And the other folks had backgrounds in all kinds of physical sciences, operations research, economics, and so forth, computer modeling. And so that was an amazing first job experience to learn all this other stuff from other disciplines and to be, located in Southern California. I mean, here's a place that has palm trees and cactus and so on, and a very different sort of sociocultural area as well. But it was great. I can't think of a better place to get dropped into and have to learn. And the fascinating thing about being in California is the plant diversity is just unbelievable. At first it was a little frustrating. Then I felt lucky if I could key a plant out to the genus. That was a successful day. But it also was very enriching in terms of, opening my eyes to, the ecology of other places and how I can learn about the ecology of places that I'm not familiar with at all. And it's eminently possible if you just put your nose down and spend time on it.
That's definitely something that I admire in both of you, is that you guys were willing to go get a job in a vastly different bioregion than where you were trained. Because I'm born in Washington. I'm from the Tri-Cities. I went to WSU and I moved into Northeastern Washington. I mean, I've within 4 hours of where I've spent my entire life. And I was so nervous to apply for jobs outside of that because I was worried I wasn't going to be able to learn these new areas quite as effectively. But I also think that's what gives you guys a lot of broader understanding, is you guys took the time to go out and learn about a whole different region and have become very successful with that.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, every move I've made, whether it's organizational or geographic, has been a very positive thing. And to be honest, I get bored pretty easily. So, when I make these moves, it provides some intellectual stimulus and growth.
Yeah.
And so I found that each move, even though, they're a little bit scary, it's a little anxiety involved, once things settled in, they were, very positive in the long run.
So what was it about? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Patrick.
No. I think your questions would be better than mine.
Well, so what was it about the Pacific Northwest that drew you up here? Because you own land here now. So clearly you have some sort of sentimental attachment.
What's not to like about the Pacific Northwest? I mean, big trees, lots of water, pretty good diversity if you look across the state from west to east, certainly. Diversity of climates and mountains. Where I grew up in Illinois, there weren't too many mountains. At least I don't remember seeing any back there. And so that was a great inspirational and spiritual thing for me, to be honest. Having a place that has so much water was kind of a psychological relief after living in Southern California for 8 years. And just the tradition of science and natural resource science and ecology in the Northwest was so good. I mean, a lot of the great ideas about forest ecology came out of the Northwest, and so that was also attractive. And when I visited here, did my job interview, it felt like a home. It felt like home. It felt right in my heart, and has felt that way ever since. I cannot imagine, living anywhere else at the moment. And my wife and I felt so attracted that we bought this 20 acres in Skagit County, Washington, and that's now where our bodies and spirits reside. And so we feel pretty dug in at the moment. We still enjoy, traveling other places, including Eastern Washington, Sean. But we also like to visit the desert Southwest and other places that kind of resonate with us in terms of, the ambience of the place, both environmentally and spiritually.
I'd really like to hear more about your property, your tree farm. Can you tell us a little more about it? Does it have a name? What are your management goals, or, all those things that we like to talk to small forest owners about. I'm really curious to hear from someone who has, so much knowledge and experience in forestry, and what it's like to put it on the ground in 20
Sure.
acres.
Well, do you have an hour or so to talk about this?
That's right.
This is going to be a long episode. I already know.
Yeah.
And I might be asking you guys for some help as well. Our tree farm is called Mountain Heart Tree Farm. And like I mentioned, it's 20 acres. It'd been pretty abused. When we bought it, it was pretty much all the area except what was in protected riparian buffers had been cut for commercial timber. And it had been cut, I think, at least twice previously, probably the big cut 100 years ago, and then some high grading in between. So it was kind of a mess. The areas that had been recently clear cut hadn't been replanted. So you can imagine what the brush looked like.
Right.
And it was a mixture of, joy, pride, and anxiety when we first bought the property, because the task of restoring the landscape seemed overwhelming at the time. Now we're 20 years down the road and things are looking pretty good. But, if I had to say one word, it would be restoration. That's been our objective on this landscape, is to get trees growing again, get as many natives growing as possible. I think right now it's probably the hot spot of biodiversity in Skagit County, because we have, I think, 110 different plant species on the property now.
Wow.
Which is pretty good. A lot of the understory trees and understory shrubs that folks don't often plant. And so that's been fun to do that. But as I told a friend recently, it seems like I learn a lot by making mistakes. And I suppose that's true of any profession. But I really had some challenges early on in translating my professional experience in book learning, if you will, to a real landscape. So, it's always vivid in my mind trying to replant an area that had been clear cut, where the logger had left a lot of hemlocks. And then what happens to hemlocks? They fall down, and you had this 3 acres of jackstrawed hemlocks and slash on the ground. And this is what I was trying to replant in. And I had in my mind, okay, 12-foot spacings on a big grid. Well, that's not exactly possible. You plant trees wherever you can and where you won't fall on your butt trying to do it. And so that was a kind of a real world experience I had. And ever since then, I've tried to put some of that standard knowledge, traditional knowledge, in the context of what I've learned over the years. And I feel like I might halfway know what I'm doing now, but I always benefit from talking to professionals like you, other folks at WSU Extension, Conservation District, friends and colleagues. Whenever I can, I get friends over and I have them walk the property with me. And I just ask them questions. What would you do here? What would you do there? And, it's a big experiment. Every tree farm, every forest is an experiment. We try things, see what works. And so I think now I'm definitely on the positive side of the ledger, but 20 years ago, it wasn't clear. It just takes a lot of time.
Did you buy that property while you were teaching at the university?
I did. And that was another challenge, was having a full-time job while taking on another full-time job of restoring a forest. So that was a significant challenge, but in those days, sleep was optional.
Can you think, this is going to be more of a philosophical question, can you think of an example of something that you experienced or learned from your tree farm that you were able to take into your education in your ecology classes that you were teaching?
Almost everything. But especially I think the relationship between forests and landscapes was critical. So much of forestry education doesn't talk about soils, doesn't talk about geomorphology. And that's the foundation of what you're doing out there. So I think just, being in a particular location, identifying, what elevation am I at? What aspect am I on? Am I in a concavity or convexity? What are the soils like here? what are the drainage properties, all that kind of fits into this complex regression equation that tells us what we should be doing at that particular place in the land. And I think a lot of forestry education is too narrow in that respect, and that maybe some of our instructors don't have that broad background we were talking about before and can bring that to bear on the situation. So what I learned and what I learned to teach was, don't give students formulas. Give them a framework through which they can make decisions. And that's what I always did in teaching, was we would go through problems, we would go through projects, and we would have students figure out what they thought would work best. And they usually, when they worked in groups, they almost always came up with a good solution. So I found that as a good approach to get people to think through things rather than, try to remember the right answer from the book or from a lecture.
Yeah, my advisor in college, Dr. Mark Swanson, I should say, was actually one of your students. And he said that the ecology graduate level course that you taught was the hardest course he ever took in his schooling.
Well, I appreciate that comment from Mark. I'll take that as a compliment. It might account for why the enrollment decreased over the years. I'm not sure. But this is a graduate course. It's good to make things challenging, but I really emphasize the projects, the analysis, not exams. I don't think I even gave exams in that class. Maybe I did. Certainly not a final exam. But critical thinking is the most important thing for an ecologist and the most important thing for resource managers. For many years, I taught classes for fire managers, and critical thinking was the number one thing in there. And a lot of folks had never been asked to do that, never been given the opportunity to take a situation, analyze it themselves, and make a decision. They were more concerned about following protocols and standard processes. And that doesn't always work. It certainly doesn't work in the new world of climate change. We have to start stretching that a little bit.
I have to imagine it was probably really rewarding. Well, one, to train new students and new foresters and new biologists and so on, but also to train people like Mark Swanson that are going to go on and then advance knowledge in the field. What was that? What's that like to be such a player in this field and have trained so many academics and been someone to really shape forestry in this region?
Well, if I had to pick one reward that's a highlight in my career, it has been the training of students and employees over the years, and providing them the tools and the capability to do sustainable resource management writ large.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of mistakes made in forestry up until about 1990. I mean, the clear cutting of the West, of course, is the biggest issue, but there wasn't this focus on sustainability and future planning and restoration and so forth. So what I've always told the students is, you got a kind of a mess out there. You got a big challenge. But the fun part is, for the rest of your careers, you get to work on bringing some of these forests back. You get to implement sustainable resource management throughout the entire U.S. Forest Service, National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, state lands, private lands. And so I think now we're seeing that shift. And some of my students are working right in the middle of that, which is pretty nice. I'll have to say, though, my experience with students was I generally learned more from them than they learned from me. Especially, I would say almost every student was more analytically adept than I was. I didn't spend as much time on statistics as I could have when I was younger. And now these folks can do statistics and computer programming and all kinds of good things, which help them in their job. But again, if I did anything, I helped to perhaps enforce upon them this concept of critical thinking, how important that was, because I wanted them to be able to go into any job and apply that. One of my students became a cardio specialist, MD. Other students ended up doing other kinds of things. But I think the same skill set applies to most other professions. Having said that, most of my students did go into some aspect of natural resources, and I'm terribly proud of the work they've been doing.
That's one thing about natural resources that I really like, and it kind of ties back for me to a class that I took, is systems thinking. That there are all these variables that are interconnected. There are feedback loops, positive and negative, and you make one decision here, and it has this this ripple effect across time and space and through the ecological webs, and that that framework of thinking, that kind of mindset of thinking, it works really well in natural resource management, but it also works really well in a lot of other aspects of life. And so it's cool that this training, which you wouldn't think, um, learning tree species and how they allocate themselves across the landscape would relate to my ability to do my taxes or something like that, but it does. There are these just weird parallels that have helped prepare me personally to be a better human, not just in my job or my work.
I'm really glad you brought up that topic of systems thinking. Every class I ever taught at the University of Washington and in other trainings with the U.S. Forest Service, the first part of every class was always system thinking. We spent an entire day, sometimes 2 days, on that topic. And we had students draw systems. And what we found was every person will draw a system differently.
Mm-hmm.
So, that brings to mind that there's not one way to look at things. Different people look at things differently. But as long as they look at it in a systems fashion, they're more likely to, number one, understand the system they're working on, and number two, to have a little humility about the system and about what they may not know or might be hidden behind the pieces that they've described. So thank you for bringing that up. I think if there's one thing that we need focus on in natural resource sciences, that would be it.
So I want to kind of return to what you said earlier about restoration. I like what you said about how, yeah, we kind of in not just in the Pacific Northwest, but just all around are a little bit inheriting a mess of the last century of management, and just trying to get forests back to a place of resiliency, of being able to reflect at least some of the elements that they did prior to some of those mistakes, while still yielding sustainable products. But it's a really difficult task, right? I mean, restoration is difficult on its own, and then you add the additional complexity of climate change, and now you're looking at a moving target. And I'm starting to feel some of this more practically. Recently took on a role with WSU, helping to manage one of their field stations in Western Washington. And there's a lot of restoration to be done. And I'm telling you, I know what you mean when you say, you're putting it on the ground. You're putting these practices you talk about all the time on the ground, and it is no small feat. There is just so much to be done. But then the sort of instability of the future makes it really difficult to know, I'm putting all this work in. Is it still the right thing? And I kind of wonder, for you as a scientist and as a land manager, how do you deal with that uncertainty?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you brought up restoration. And so restoration didn't exist until about 30 years ago as a concept, as a discipline. And so now it's very well established. In the state of Washington, there are so many people who do restoration now, public agencies, lots of non-governmental organizations, conservation groups, tribes. It's a very entrenched concept. And although I use the term restoration myself, I'm starting to use the term building resilience more often. You alluded to that yourself right there, Patrick, because we can't restore to a past target anymore.
Right.
That's not far enough. It's good if we can do that. We've usually had these targets based on historical range of variability of, whatever it is, fire or water or insects or whatever. So if we can at least do that, that's good, but then we can't stop there. We have to push it into what does the future range of variability look like? So that's why building resilience is maybe a better term in the future. Not to throw out restoration, but just don't stop there, keep going, and not to focus our targets so much on species. If we have the right species out there, then we'll be okay. I'm more concerned about functionality. Maybe we can tolerate some change in species distribution and abundance if we still have a functional forest. It's productive, has good photosynthetic rates, it provides habitat for the critters we want, and so forth. So that's kind of a long background to answering your question about how I think about the uncertainty. Doing a risk assessment is the first step to any project. Whether it's a restoration project or reforestation, whatever you want to call it. Say, okay, here are some things I can do. What are the risks involved here? What's the likelihood that my trees that I plant will survive? What's the likelihood that deer are going to eat my trees? What's the likelihood that we'll have a big flood in this area or whatever? And then you implement risk management that addresses those risks. There's two aspects to risk. One is the magnitude of something that may or may not occur, and the other is the probability that something may or may not occur. So on the west side, if we have a fire, of course, that's going to have a big effect, but the probability of that fire is relatively low. So you need to look at both aspects of it. Then the risk management needs to take into account, just like we were talking about before, the local landscape, what things look like uphill, what things look like downhill, and then make a decision. But I think the most important thing there is to have whatever restoration or building resilience approach you use, diversify it. Don't lock yourself into one particular thing throughout the landscape. Maybe do a few different things here and there. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. And so that's my way of trying to kind of spread the risk on my own tree farm as I do different things in different places. And the assumption is that at least in some and probably most places, things will work out for the best. But even if something doesn't work, if I screwed up, made a bad decision in one place, I've still got the rest of it to fall back on. And I think that's a reasonable approach for any landowner or forest manager.
So I actually am really glad that the way you stated that with restoration, because the word restore implies that you're moving to some precondition, some condition that is not currently in. And I think, we all have these nightmares of pretty much all the change in the last 100 years since pre-European settlement. The Euro-American settlement period was where we kind of start to draw that line. But whenever I meet with landowners for the first time, we always get into this discussion of what is native, right? What are the plants that we see as native on this landscape? And I think that the definition is constantly changing. And so, like, if we go back to especially the last, from 100 years ago to 40,000 years ago, we tried to remove humans from the conversation of native participants in the ecosystem, but we were vastly a part of the ecosystem, and we've been dictating what that ecosystem was for a long time. And so I think it's interesting that we try to restore to a pre-European settlement period when Native Americans prior to that period were, like you said, actually managing based on functionality. They were managing systems that provided the ecosystem services that they needed to, sustain their culture and their communities, whether that was fish, whether that was deer, whether that was lodgepole for building, whatever that resource was, they were constantly managing it based on the environment that they were in so that they could, rely on that, that system. And so I think we have to change the way we think about, managing our forests, not to revert it to some prior condition, but to look at the structure and the composition and all these different facets of the forest that then end up making it more, like you said, resilient to the future, because that ultimately is the goal, is that we can have this snowball that continues to roll in the face of all of, the bumps and hurdles that we're going to cross in the next 150 years and theoretically much longer.
Yeah, that's a great point. Even if we look at, take Westside Washington, our common tree species, Douglas fir, western hemlock, western red cedar, they're very common right now, but they've been common for only about 3,000 years. And that, I should say, not just common, but dominant across the landscape. And that's only about 5 or 6 generations of trees, because these species all grow to be 500 years plus, right? So that's not many generations of an organism to say that that's sort of our archetype or that's our target. The other thing you alluded to was this concept of naturalness. And I think a lot of people have sort of a gestalt impression of what they consider to be natural or normal or desirable. But whenever I talk about this concept of restoration, I really, one of the first things I say is we aren't working with natural systems and most of the planet right now. If we look at the state of Washington, over 90% of our forests have been cut at least once, sometimes twice. We've made a lot of changes in terms of agriculture, urbanization, lots of non-native species across the landscape, lots of exotic insects and pathogens. And oh yeah, there's those millions of people we also have out there. And we've done things also like, basically remove beavers from the landscape. Beavers were a keystone animal in terms of creating forest structures and wetlands and wildlife habitat until the late 1800s, when we removed that. So rather than get hung up on what is natural, why don't we talk about what we want? What are our objectives? What species do we want? What kinds of functionality do we want? If somebody likes to have an open forest with well-spaced trees, regardless of the other benefits that might provide, say on the east side of the Cascades in terms of fire reduction, if that's a personal perspective, if aesthetics are one of your objectives, nothing wrong with that. As long as we don't get too far out and say, well, I'd like to plant a lot of monkey puzzle trees on my land, or something like that, or eucalyptus or whatever. That might be a little bit on the edge, but if we put that concept of naturalness aside, it opens up a lot of opportunities and creative thinking for us. And let's do some experimentation, share ideas, and find out what works in this new climate change world.
Well, you're kind of touching on something that I've really wanted to discuss with you. There's a lot of things that I want to discuss with you about climate change, but the monkey puzzle joke is funny. But you'd be surprised just how close I get to that question. But one of the things that we talk about a lot nowadays with a shifting climate is shifting species. Assisted migration, and whether or not we should do it, versus something like switching seed zones, using trees from more southerly seed zones, which is something that I think is kind of becoming much more acceptable. Even in the last few years, it seems like people are talking about that, as or at least being much more open to that. But I know myself, I get a lot of questions about assisted migration, particularly moving redwoods up here, assuming that that's just going to be the sort of status quo in 50 or 100 years, that this area is going to look like Northern California. And I think you would probably, I assume you would call that a little bit of a leap in moving species that far. But I'm kind of curious, in your mind, what is not acceptable, but what's within a margin of risk to try right now? What would you say is kind of out of bounds versus might be worth exploring right now?
So Patrick, you're opening the door on a huge topic right now. And it's so interesting because assisted migration was something that the forest community didn't want to talk about 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Now it seems like that's all they want to talk about because they've seen some adverse things happening following recent droughts and so forth. And I need to, present the big caveat here that there's precious little science to support what we should be doing with assisted migration.
Right.
That doesn't mean we've been negligent. It just means we don't currently have the information that we need to make decisions. And we might not have it in a timely way, and we still need to move forward with those decisions. So you mentioned the word risk, and I'm going to go back to my earlier comment on doing risk assessments. I think that's exactly what we need to do with assisted migration. And after talking to a lot of colleagues who know a lot more about forest genetics and other topics than I do, and thinking about it and looking at data, I've concluded that we should start thinking about expanding our seed zones. Using seed zones farther south or at lower elevations under the assumption that those trees, that genetic stock would be more tolerant of a warmer climate. We don't actually know that's true in all cases, but it's a pretty good assumption. So yes, I definitely support landowners increasing the diversity of your nursery stock if you can. So maybe you want to plant 50% of the local seed zone and 50% farther south. I mean, this is just guesswork. There's no recipe. But I do think that the risk of doing that is very low, and the payoff might be significant.
Right.
In terms of moving species, I think it would be reasonable in some cases to move species slightly farther north than their current distribution. So, what is slightly farther? I have no idea. I'm just going to say 100 miles or so, um, under the assumption that you could probably do that without too many negative outcomes. But to do it, I'd say at first, maybe experimentally or as part of a larger project, but don't just go out there and plant 1,000 acres of that species. In terms of moving species long distance, your point about moving coast redwood or giant sequoia or white fir or sugar pine up into Washington, I think for now let's not do that.
Right.
Because if we're looking at risk assessment, I think there's a significant risk that those species will not be resistant to some of the local pathogens and insects. They may also bring in pathogens and insects that local species are not resistant to. So if somebody wants to plant a few redwoods, I'd say go for it. Plant a few sequoias, I'd say go for it. I've actually planted about 20 incense cedars on my property just because I kind of like them, and they do grow quite well. But to do this very thoughtfully, and before we move species hundreds of miles, I think we need a little bit more scientific information about those risks. There are plant pathologists, forest pathologists working on this right now. And like I said, we might not have the information very soon, but I think in 20 or 30 years, we'll have enough information to do those sorts of things. The other consideration with moving species long distances, at least if you're interested in timber production at all, is there may not be a market for the use of that wood. Yeah. And maybe the combination of those species with local species creates some ecological outcomes we could not have foreseen. So I think we want to make decisions that have low risks, and if we take higher risk, do it very cautiously, experimentally for now.
So I love to play devil's advocate with things, and I had two thoughts that came up in this conversation. You actually answered one of them, and that was your comment with invasive species or insects, forest health problems being transferred with or being prone to the new species that are in the area. I think the other one that I'm really interested in is we have a lot, like if so everyone's trying to pick plants from California and move them up to Washington, and that's because I think everyone looks at the latitudinal gradient of moisture precipitation, and that seems to be, we would think these would match what the new precipitation gradient is. However, seasonally, moisture is not the same in how it's delivered between California and here. And I think a lot of people think that if you move them across these environments, while yes, in a year or an annual span, it might be similar, when they get it will be very different. And I think you've talked about it in some of your writing, things like temperatures and bud development in certain trees, how that will match. I'm curious, because the tricky thing about climate change is the future prediction of it. And models and predicting, it always gets a little wishy-washy, and we try our best, but it's always a prediction. And I think when you move species, you're trying to make this prediction of what is it best going to move into, and what would be its ability to evolve or adapt into that new site. But how are we really good at doing that modeling of being able to say, this is going to match this, but then be able to model all of the parameters that that species is going to need to be able to successfully then, establish and become a part of the biodiversity that we would need to have that resiliency in the forest?
We certainly don't know enough to do that yet. We know a lot about trees. We know a lot about the natural history of forests in the western United States. But some of the things like you just mentioned about the seasonality of life history of trees and bud break and pollination, all these sorts of things are certainly factors to think about. I do feel like the biggest factor we need to consider is the effects of more frequent and extensive droughts. Uh, we have dry summers in the Pacific Northwest. We always have dry summers, especially on the east side. And that dryness might become more accentuated in the future. So that's likely to be the big bottleneck that species will have to go through. Now, I'm actually a pretty big believer in the genetic diversity of our existing tree species and seed zones. Most of these Western conifers have high diversity, high genetic diversity. They've been around for many thousands of years under different climatic regimes. And you take a species like Douglas fir, which is distributed from British Columbia down to Mexico. So we know that species has a lot of genetic diversity. It's found all those niches all over the West where it can live. It flourishes on the west side, it does reasonably well on the east side of the Cascades. And I'm also not willing to give up on these species. So I know a lot of folks, particularly small private landowners, will say, well, I don't want to plant red cedars because I'm afraid they're going to die in this drier weather. And I think there are lots of places on our landscapes where we can plant them in north aspects, drainages, concavities. Those microsites are something we need to think about harder and more consciously now. Is not just have a prescription for planting all Douglas fir or all of some other species, but where will each species fit in the future? So I think a species like Western red cedar will do just fine in many locations if you plant it in the right spot, and if you manage the densities of these stands such that you minimize competition for water. So at the moment, I think we need to take what we have at hand, what we know about well, work with that, do it in a smart way, and gradually work in, perhaps other genetics and other ways of doing things, but not to throw out our current methodology and toolkit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And to kind of focus in on Western red cedar as an example, dealing with the red cedar decline that we are in Western Washington for sure, and I know in Eastern Washington too. The way I've tried to explain it to landowners is that what we're seeing is that the habitable zone of this species is maybe just getting a little more narrow. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist anymore. So like a cedar going on a spot that's just short of being too dry for what it likes may not be able to grow in that particular spot in the next 50 years, right? But that doesn't mean that there's not plenty of areas that are totally hospitable to Western red cedar and continue to grow, as you mentioned. Drainages, sites with just better moisture. So that's kind of how I've been framing it, because it is really easy to see Western red cedar dying along roadsides, especially these areas that are already under a lot of stress, and just kind of click and think, okay, well, Red Cedar's not the tree anymore. It's just not the tree I'm going to pick. But I don't think that we need to go that far. I also still have a lot of hope for our native species and the genetic variability within them.
There's some interesting recent studies out of California of some of the higher elevation forests in the Sierra Nevada that seem to already be adapting to a warmer climate. They've actually altered their genetic composition a bit. Again, these are some studies done by folks who know a lot more about forest genetics than I do. But that's very heartening to me that we can measure this kind of response over a period of many decades as opposed to centuries, and it gives us hope for the genetic foundation that these conifers have. That doesn't mean it's going to work for every species, but at least there's some evidence that can occur at a relatively short time scale in response to a warmer climate. So I try to look for the positive aspects of things, life in general. And so I think if we stick with some of our native species, current tools, current approaches, that will reduce our risk in the short run. Once we get into the latter part of the 21st century, we'll have to see what things look like then. We might reevaluate that approach.
Do you think that, everybody's so focused on either taking species and moving them out of their range, or taking even within species within a range, moving it down in its precipitation tolerance. Do you think there's a role for processes such as selective breeding to actually contain just one species and then try to breed genetic traits that are more resistant? So even just saying, going to Douglas fir and selecting interior Douglas fir and crossbreeding it with maybe the coastal Douglas fir, and then planting that kind of hybridized variety into areas we think that you might see more drought?
I don't see why not. We've been breeding plants and trees for over a century now, and so that's certainly a very reasonable approach. Like any process, we should probably do that cautiously and selectively.
Yeah.
People
Risk
get
assessment.
people get upset about genetic engineering these days. I don't particularly. I think there may be a role for that. We certainly have been breeding trees like rust-resistant western white pine
White pine. Yeah.
and rust-resistant eastern white pine. And now we have some rust-resistant white bark pine. And we may need those to save that species.
Yeah.
Because that's a species that certainly is in pretty rough shape around the West, and we have small populations that are declining quickly due to not just blister rust, but also in some cases mountain pine beetles. In some cases, lack of fire. So they really are quite stressed at the moment. And if we can get some rust-resistant genes out in the landscape, and I think that we're dealing here with an exotic disease, a non-native disease. So we need to take whatever measures we can to retain that species. And I hope we don't get to that desperation point with some of our more common conifers and hardwoods, but let's be prepared. And what would we do if we got to that point? I think that's the question.
So I wanted to jump in on something you just said right there, and you were talking about bark beetles. So I have conversations with some of the local forest and entomologists up here, and one of the fears that they have are the tree species at the bottom of the environmental condition gradient, right? So specifically ponderosa pine along the sagebrush kind of elevational band, forest type band. And the worry is that we are going to increasingly see areas where ponderosa pine can't even be established. Or even you could go up into the mixed conifer, the dry Doug fir ponderosa pine mixtures. And this action of wanting to put ponderosa pine into these stands because it's the more drought tolerant species. But one of the issues that's been posed against that is we see, even in native species, native forest health issues that attack things like Douglas fir beetle, or in the case of ponderosa pine, you have ips, you've got a red turpentine beetle, you've got the western pine beetle, you've got the mountain pine beetle. There's a litany of native pests and pathogens that we could actually be homogenizing the landscape. And I know you've talked about diversity as a major way to manage against or manage for resiliency, but how do you do that when you're already at the fringe of environmental conditions that can really only support one species at its current point?
That's a tough problem. I'm glad you brought up ponderosa pine on the east side of Washington in particular. There have definitely been some interesting situations following recent big wildfires, for example, where regeneration is being planned. And the question is, particularly at the lower elevation on the interface with sagebrush and grassland, should we put pines back there? And I think you have to take this on a case by case basis. Look at the topography, geomorphology, and soils, and see what the likelihood is that those ponderosa pines could tolerate increasing drought stress in the future. I know of at least one case on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest where, when they started looking at the soils where the trees had burned, they found that the soils were more characteristic of grassland soils, suggesting that the trees were a relatively new presence on that landscape. So maybe that's an area where you let it go back to grassland or shrubs and don't try to force ponderosa pine back into it. So it's critical to look at each particular location. In terms of kind of a monocultural concept, like you mentioned, we could certainly encourage genetic diversity in those stands. That's one thing. And also try to reduce any other sources of stress other than moisture stress that we can. That usually means, doing good stand density management, keeping density sufficiently low to reduce competition. And then any other stressors that might occur, but that would be the most common one. So that's probably about all that we can do. But I think there's a little bit of panic going on right now, and that if we have one regeneration failure, it's always going to fail. I think that's always been true, whether we're dealing with natural regeneration from seeding or whether we're planting trees. They don't always all take. I've planted trees on my property, and most years they do wonderful. But I had a big planting that had a terribly dry spring and summer, and most of them died. So we're always going to have that, and we have to assess again the risk of that occurring versus something else occurring. So we'll be doing a lot of experimentation, I think, across the landscape, especially in some of our east side forests, to determine, what are those sites where ponderosa pine will do best, and what are our genetic provenances that will do best as well. I wish I had like a really solid answer, but that's the best we can do.
That's pretty good. Well, I'm glad that you brought up regeneration, because it's another one of the things I wanted to talk about. Considering climate change, I really think that is going to be one of the most susceptible stages or practices, projects for forest owners. I mean, it's going to be one of those points where people are really at a lot of, at higher risk because, well, the seedlings are at higher risk. They're just sensitive at that stage. And I've already heard of regeneration projects or reforestation projects failing because of particularly hot, dry summers. I think it was 2018 where we didn't get any rain in the month of May in Southwest Washington. It was really bad. Last year we had the heat dome, and things like this that can really knock a whole year setback on reforestation. It's something that people want to avoid. For sure. And most people don't have insurance on their seedlings. So that money's, it's coming out of their pocket. So I'm kind of curious from you, what do you see going forward? Obviously, planting more drought tolerant species is an option, but in terms of actual reforestation practices, what are some options for people to kind of encourage or increase the likelihood of survival?
Yeah. Well, I'm a huge proponent of planting in the fall.
I was going to ask you that.
Now, and for better or worse, our nurseries tend to release their seedlings in late winter to early spring. That's the typical cycle. And I've certainly had much better success fall planting. And so what I've been doing on our property recently is I'll get seedlings, in the spring. I plant them in the garden, in some good soil with plenty of water, and then I get them about 3 times bigger, and I plant them out in the fall. And those trees have a much higher probability of success, and not just survival, but surviving in the face of competition from shrubs and so forth. So that's one big one. I'd love to see a lot more flexibility in our forestry production systems for seedlings and distribution of those systems. All the native plant sales are in the late winter, early spring. Same thing.
Would that hold true for both East and Western Washington?
I think so. And you'd have to be a little bit more careful there because of the snow situation. So that's something definitely to think about. But to try to identify whatever time it may be that would be the ideal time, as opposed to we always did it this way, so we're going to continue to do it this way. So think creatively and flexibly. It might vary a lot, Sean, in terms of where exactly you were at, especially low elevation versus high elevation on the east side. So that's one thing. The other thing is to, at least where you can, do this, to use some kind of mulch. Now, I know we can't, if you're planting thousands of trees, you're not going to be hauling mulch around on a mountainside, but use some of the local organic material that's in the area, or maybe you have some slash left over that you can masticate, grind it up, and use it as mulch on the site. Just kick up something around the base of that tree to hold moisture. And then the other thing is to reduce the other sources of stress, which often is herbivory from deer or voles or whatever, beavers. And I just this morning saw an email discussion on that topic. And a lot of people doing restoration have tremendous problems from critters that like to eat trees. And in some cases, that may be a much bigger stress than water is in certain locations. So all of those things, but to reduce stressors where you can. That means more expense, more time, but we may just have to do that.
What do you think of scattering logging debris after harvesting? There was a paper that came out showing that really helped with, one, soil retention, but it also reduced noxious weeds after harvesting. And it was even there was even less herbivory because deer can be kind of lazy. They don't really like to go through all the logs and all that stuff. So to me, it seems like a win-win-win, except maybe for the tree planters.
Right.
You may be paying a premium for planting on bigger jobs,
or fire-prone areas.
Fire-prone areas too. You're even on the west side. Your likelihood of fire would increase at least for a few years.
Yeah, I saw that paper too. I really liked that paper. It was intriguing. I greatly support keeping as much of that organic material on the site as possible and is logical for that site. Now, on the east side, like you said, Sean, we need to be careful with that, but we can always put large material out there. We don't want to put 3 inches or less diameter stuff because that's what would burn actively on the surface, but we can certainly put out logs, big branches, those sorts of things without increasing fire risk. And they sometimes they even provide shade for little seedlings, but they retain moistures, they add organic matter. Absolutely. Let's do more of that. It kind of kills me sometimes when I see these enormous slash piles with large woody material in them, and then they just go up in smoke or they just decompose in place, because there's a real valuable role, I think, in regeneration for some of those forests.
Yeah, I'm probably going to get myself in trouble by doing this, so I'm going to leave the name of the researcher in the paper out of it. But I do know somebody who's working on just a very simple study of planting seedlings underneath shade logs, and then changing the aspect or the position in which they're facing. And from what I've heard, the results have actually been very promising. That just something as simple as a large 10-inch or larger coarse woody debris lay down on the ground and then seedlings planted along that is having a profound effect on the ability of just the temperature and the small amount of precipitation that doesn't evaporate out of that point. And it's just enough for that seedling to get big enough, get its roots deep into the ground where it can survive.
That totally makes sense. Earlier in my career, I did a lot of work on subalpine forest ecology, and we looked at regeneration of subalpine fir, mountain hemlock, those sorts of species after wildfires. It's a pretty harsh landscape at high elevation. And the regeneration success was almost, well, it was just huge in terms of whether or not a seedling was behind a rock, a log, or a shrub. They always did better by a huge statistical amount. So that got my attention very early on. But if we don't have that debris, we can still use things like shade cards, little cardboard barriers or something out there. Some people use those routinely. Another expense, a little more time for the tree planters, but it gives us another tool that we can think about using, especially if we're on a south aspect. Maybe not on a north aspect, but on those really harsh sites, that might be the way to do it.
So, when I sit down with people sometimes, and I always get philosophical, I love to ask the question about some of our fringe sites, specifically the ones that are typically a little bit more moist right now, where we might see rose bushes growing. I guess I'm thinking of the classical east side situations here: rose bushes, twin flowers, a lot of the grand fir cedar mixtures. And I think there's some worry that we need to manage these for fire, or we need to decrease stand density. And so then I asked the philosophical question of, in the face of climate change, in these rarer forest types, do we protect them in a way that we look at it as protecting a rare form into the future to increase that diversity of forest types, or do we actively manage them to change the structure or to change the species composition in a way that we think is going to be more resilient to climate change into the future, with the acceptance of we are losing some biodiversity at the landscape level? And so I still want you to ask the question, but it seems like you've already sort of answered it today, in that you've talked about these, go find these little microsites, or, the headwaters of a stream, or, a bowl down in the bottom of a valley. And maybe that's where we try to protect these. So then I guess my follow-up question then would be, at the scale of a landscape. I mean, maybe for small forest landowners, this question is a little easier because you're only thinking about 20 acres. Even for them, that's a lot of land. But at the scale of a landscape, how do we go about trying to identify and find all of these tiny little variations in the landscape, where we say, oh, okay, let's plant this little 1 acre strip with cedar right here, and then the rest is, I mean, this level of granularity seems like it's too complex. And then when we put that in the face of efficiency and trying to manage and become resilient against climate change, which is only speeding up faster, to me, I don't know how those can both happen at the same time.
What you have stated here is one of our biggest challenges in natural resource management: is how do we do this task of building resilience and being climate smart at large spatial scales. So, I mean, fortunately, we have great geospatial maps nowadays. We have great remote sensing imagery, and I think that, at least my experience working with national forests, they're doing a pretty good job of identifying some of those special places out on the landscape that could be susceptible to that big wildfire, or to some other particular problem that could occur. So I think to a great extent we kind of know where some of those places are. Then it comes down to the hard decision of how many of these can we invest in significantly to preserve, or to augment, or to modify somehow with maybe some climate smart management. And there may be some trade-offs. We can't do it everywhere. For every particular national forest or state forest or whatever, but to at least be aware of what's out there. I mean, the same thing is true of endangered species. By law, we're required to protect endangered species, but we need to have a functional, viable ecosystem that provides the habitat for those species. So we can't do this species by species or plant community by plant community anymore. I do think, Sean, that particularly for the example you cited for these east side kinds of special communities, that fire will be an increasing risk on north aspects, in drainages, and even in riparian areas. I think we're already seeing a lot of that happening. We used to think that the riparian areas were kind of fireproofed, asbestos forest out there, but we know there's no such thing anymore, given the right kind of high severity fire. So I do think if I were to make one trade-off, it would be to do some management that would reduce fire risk by removing or maybe decreasing the density of trees and also reducing surface fuels where possible. That could be prescribed burning, it could be mechanical, whatever, but I think that's the big risk out there is fire to, any system anywhere on the east side, and even increasingly a little bit more on the west side.
You mentioned prescribed fire, and interesting debate for Eastern Washington right now. I think the use of fire is known that it is a tool. However, there are certainly drawbacks to it. It's relatively uncontrolled. I will. That is definitely within a bubble, but we are getting much better at controlling them. It is risky, and I think a lot of people are really worried about the smoke. And so a question that I've kind of had for myself is, does the trade-offs of burning outpace the trade-offs of not burning if we were only using, say, chemical or mechanical methods of managing these surface fuels? And I would say Paul Hesburgh was very adamantly for burning when he joined us on the podcast.
Well, again, it depends on the location. I keep saying this. It depends on the site, depends on the location, depends on not just the ecological situation, but the sociological and political situation.
Yeah.
We know that prescribed burning has great benefits ecologically, and it reduces the risk of high severity fire. That's why we do it. We're not doing it to eliminate fire, but to reduce the intensity and then the severity of the effects. So we know that works. But we also know that realistically, it will be impossible financially and logistically to do this at a large enough scale to make a significant difference on reducing fire risk in most Western forests. If our budgets for doing this were 10 times what they are, we still probably wouldn't be able to do it at a 10 times larger spatial scale because of air quality restrictions, because of the riskiness of starting fires in certain landscapes, because of the intolerance of certain communities to having smoke in that area. So this is really more of a sociological problem than it is a biological problem, in my view. The other challenge with prescribed burning is it's not always effective. I don't know. You mentioned it might be risky. I don't see it as being particularly risky if we do it under the right circumstances. But our stereotypical way of viewing this is, we have a nice prescribed burn. It gets rid of all those surface fuels, and then you're good for 20 or 30 years. But the real world tells us that we end up with a mosaic of fuel reduction across any particular landscape. So it's not 100% reliable. Mechanical means of removing fuels are reliable, 100% reliable. We can pull out the exact amount of fuels we want. We can do thinning, remove the exact number of trees we want. The problem is that costs about 7 times more than doing prescribed burning. But it's a much more effective and reliable approach to reducing fuels. But it's probably not realistic either, financially or organizationally. So we're kind of stuck. I think, therefore, we're left with the option of being very strategic in how we do fuel reduction in the past. There's a lot of talk now about anchoring these treatments on recent large wildfires that we've had. So we can expand that footprint of lower fuels in areas where it will make the most difference, where it will have the greatest impact in terms of reducing fire spread into communities or municipal watersheds or other resources that we value. And I think that does make sense that we quite often when we do prescribed burning, we might do it in places where it's easy to do because that's, nobody wants an escape burn. We want to be able to be effective in our actions, but that may not be the best place on the landscape. So I generally see us continuing to do prescribed burning in areas that are near the wildland-urban interface or near areas of high value, and let's do a good job with that. The rest of that landscape is probably going to be on its own, and we'll continue to do most of our fuel treatments with wildfires, for better or worse. I know there's a lot of buzz about, oh, we need to let more of our wildfires burn. And and that's already an option, of course. We don't do it very often because most of our resource managers are risk averse. Nobody wants an escaped wildfire on their watch, and that's totally understandable. So that is not a realistic way of trying to reintroduce fire across these landscapes. So let's be very thoughtful about where we do it and optimize it where possible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like the socioeconomic piece. I mean, how do you, like you said, even if we could get everyone on board, it probably wouldn't be an option. But, you know, we, as foresters, we're trying no longer to be specialists, right? We're trying to be generalists, but we also don't always have extension foresters aside have the best people skills, the best communication skills, working with the public. But so, I mean, how would you say we go about getting people on board for this kind of thing, for this, and not just fire, but I really think that people need to play a role in the resiliency building / restoration that we were talking about earlier. There's a term called biocultural restoration that's kind of going around now that I think is really important. And it just means involving people in these practices, because it's really, as Sean pointed out, sort of ignorant to deny that people are a part of the landscape and just pretend that we can go to some pre-settlement era. So I'm just kind of curious, looking forward, how do we get people involved and sort of come to terms with that socioeconomic piece? Because I think often that becomes the last hurdle, aside from budget, right?
Yeah, what you have mentioned, Patrick, is the key to the whole situation. And because people are complex, that means the solution is going to be complex as well and probably a little messy. But we start with the fact that people live everywhere in wildlands now. There's almost nowhere you can go except wilderness areas where people don't live right on the edge of a national forest or a state forest or tribal lands or, any particular area. So whatever we do out there will affect some community of people somewhere.
Right.
And we can no longer deny that or to say that we know best and you people just have to go along with us, because that in the past we might have got away with that, but we don't get away with that now. So engaging people early and often is the key as partners and as good communicators ourselves. So the best approach I've seen is this concept of fire adapted communities, with the concept being of learning how to live with fire risk, not resisting it, not denying it, but how can we be prepared? And I've always found when people are prepared for risks, or if we're ready for an earthquake or ready for a fire, ready for a flood, that provides great relief psychologically. And then there's no longer as much stress and anxiety for people in terms of dealing with that. So we have good examples now in the state of Washington, particularly on the east side, of these fire adapted communities. That takes a lot of work. It's all about talking with people. It's about engaging the local fire managers, not just the agencies, but the municipal firefighters as well, who are often local leaders and well respected, and find opinion leaders and organizations in the community that can be neutral brokers of this information. And it may take you 3, 4, 5 years to build that, but that's the most successful approach that I have seen. The other thing that can help enable that is to do risk assessment mapping for different locations, so that people can look at that map for their county and they can see, well, where do I fall here, and what do we need to do as a county or as a community to deal with this? And if you can make it a collective problem, if there's trust in the room, then you're much more likely to develop solutions that everybody can live with.
It was interesting. I did my master's down in Lake County, Oregon, which sadly this year was heavily impacted by wildfires. But one thing that I noticed when I was there, especially in those extremely rural Forest Service areas, was the number of people that lived in that community that worked for the Forest Service. Proportionally, it was high above the rest of the populace of the town. Almost anyone that wasn't working for the Forest Service in that specific district was pretty much just a rancher. And one of the things that I saw was the ability to make decisions in tandem with the needs of the community was really effective. Because they had people that were from that community that relied on that community a part of that decision making process. And so I get that we're not always going to be able to hire every single person from our town, especially as that starts to scale upwards. But it just shines light on the need for people to have access to and be able to and be willing to come to the table to make to be a part of the voice of people, to say, here are the things that we need, and here is here's my voice in the conversation of management going forward in the face of creating this resiliency.
Yeah, no, that's critical, and this, we're finding that this applies not just to fire, which is kind of our hot button issue, but it applies to all aspects of resource management these days. If we look at our national forests and state forests, very few of them are effective at implementing large scale or even small scale management activities these days unless they already have good partnerships built with local organizations and community groups. Because we're starting to kind of switch this on its head. It used to be there was a lot of antagonism between big government and the locals. And now that we are starting to get people working together in these long-term partnerships, we're getting things done. And the federal and state agencies are starting to realize that this works. In the past, they hated going to public meetings and all this, chaos and people yelling at each other. But if you sit around the table, have coffee together, have a beer together, you're much more likely to reach solutions and to find that you have a lot more in common than you do have differences. And almost everybody in the room will have what I call a conservation ethic. They kind of have a similar goal in terms of they want healthy forests, they want some greenery out there, they don't want to have to escape a burning house. Everybody shares that. So it's just a matter of agreeing upon and developing the trust in those relationships to actually put things on the ground and then follow through on them. It's been, I'd say during my career, this has been one of the great areas of progress that we've had sociologically in natural resources.
What do you see as the role of small forest landowners in the future when it comes to, I'm not even going to say a resilient forest, but a resilient climate? What is the role of small forest landowners in that equation?
Well, first of all, we know that small forest landowners own a big chunk of the land out there. What is it, about 25% of forest land in the
At a
state of
national level
Washington?
or statewide? I think it's about,
For state of Washington?
thought the number I had heard was about 15%.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Still a big chunk.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
So I think, for better or worse, sometimes small forest landowners get left out of the conversation. And yet, it's a big part of the larger matrix of land ownership in different places. And so I think we were talking before about with prescribed burning, how you can kind of build on these large wildfires. I think there's an opportunity here for small forest landowners to build onto bigger efforts by some of the agency lands that abut their landscape. And I know whenever I talk to small forest landowners, I say, don't just think about your 10 acres or your 100 acres, but what's around you. It doesn't do much good if you do a really good job at forestry and if you reduce your fuels and if you use climate smart practices, if none of your neighbors do, because you're still going to be vulnerable there. So again, I know I keep bringing this up. I think there's a sociological barrier there of getting people to communicate with one another and kind of think of themselves as a community. Now, I know you folks in WSU Extension do a great job of trying to create that network of landowners. It almost becomes kind of a group think that can spread across the landscape. And I think we're just starting that, in all honesty. I think people are more curious now than they were 10 years ago, in all honesty. And they realize that things are happening with climate change, things are happening with fire. There's more at stake than they ever thought about, and there's more problems than they've thought about before. So I think we're getting there. But every single educational program that we have, I think we need to stress this idea of sharing our stories. What worked on my property? I'm going to share that with my neighbors so they can do it too. And I want to know what they did so I can maybe implement that on my property. And so this is going to be a long-term goal, but I can't think of any better thing. The other thing too is that I think that the federal and state agencies need to do a better job of reaching out to small forest landowners. I mean, they've already got their hands full, right? They've got a lot of stuff to do with small staffs typically. But I think if there are more people who are dedicated to doing that public outreach, that will improve the relationship. It'll also improve the flow of information, and sometimes, actual, people support and financial support, cost sharing programs, for example. Forest Service has done some of that over the years. So that's another way to do it. Most national and state forests are realizing the value of partnerships, and quite often now they have positions called partnership coordinators. 10 years ago, that didn't exist. What's a partnership coordinator? Now these are important people through whom many of these different issues and discussions flow. And so I think what I'd like to see is an expansion of the creation of these partnerships. And small forest landowners, they feel like they're out there on their own sometimes. They've got good support from WSU Extension and sometimes from Washington Department of Natural Resources. But you guys don't have that much time either. We need to kind of a steady partners over time, somewhere you can always go to ask a question and get help. So I think we just need to strengthen those relationships over time.
Yeah, I really agree with everything that you said, and I think there's something that our team leader Andy Perleyberg, who I'm sure you know, instilled in me early on, which is when in all those programs, it's really important to demonstrate to small forest owners what they contribute to the landscape, because when you are just sitting on 20 acres, 10 acres, even 100 acres, it's still, it doesn't seem like that much in the stretch of millions of acres, but when you get a field day where you've got 250 landowners in one spot, that's a big chunk of acreage. And moreover, when we talk about resiliency, diversity, hedging your bets and contributing to that across the landscape, I don't think anybody does that better than small forest owners, because by nature, they're being managed by thousands of different people with different management objectives. And so they contribute all this diversity to the landscape in a way that's really, I think, highly beneficial. And so it is definitely up to us to create a network of support for them so that they can continue that and continue contributing that to the landscape.
And if you think about it, we cut all these forests 10 acres at a time. So we have to rebuild these forests 10 acres at a time
Right.
too. As nobody said this would be easy, but it is doable. And I think once landowners see that it is doable, even if they aren't foresters, they aren't biologists, most of them. And so I think there's this huge kind of anxiety level they have to get through that they can do this stuff, or they can hire somebody to do it for them, and they won't screw it up. There's also the challenge that you both of you know so very well, and that's to get people to do any active management at all. Because there's such a focus on aesthetics and habitat that sometimes we don't see that there may be some need for intervention and a chainsaw here and there to create the conditions that will provide a sustainable forest for a long term.
I'm always surprised by how many people really like their evergreen holly in their forest. Yep. And I have to break their heart and say, no, you should probably cut that out of there.
I do have one more question. I'm going to see if I can squeeze it into the conversation earlier, because it didn't. We got to the 10,000 foot level right there at the end, and it just wasn't going to fit in. But in the discussion of climate change management, and specifically around carbon storage, there is this debate between carbon sequestration and carbon storage. And then there are the graphs of like, okay, well, carbon sequestration from the year 20 to the year 60 is at its greatest point, whereas after 60 years, carbon storage becomes the primary factor, and we want to store as much carbon into that period. And so obviously, as any good forest manager would say, the answer is complex and it depends. But I think that there is some conversation to be said of proportionality. What's the proportion of our forest that we should keep in this sequestration phase, and what's the proportion of the forest that we should try to keep into the storage phase, and whose role is it to keep that? So would you be able to put a stab or a prediction at an answer to that? What would be your hypothesis?
Well, I don't have a magic number for you in terms of proportion, but the way I like to think about it and the way I like to explain it is that younger, fast-growing forests take up a lot of carbon, and that older forests, after they have slowed down in their growth a bit, store a lot of carbon. Now, in terms of our other discussions about diversification of forest management, it makes sense to me to have a range of forest ages in your portfolio, whether that's an individual landowner or whether we're talking about a 1,000,000-acre portion of a national forest or whatever, that if we have some variability in that landscape in terms of uptake and storage, that probably gives us the best situation in terms of long-term carbon uptake and storage. Now, I should also mention that a couple things. First of all, whenever you have a fire, you're going to lose a lot of carbon. So we may want to manage such that we can reduce those high intensity fires and those rapid loss of high amounts of carbon emissions. In addition, when we use forest products, we are storing carbon at various lengths of time. If we put that carbon in durable wood products, into houses, furniture, that sort of thing, that we are substituting in some cases for concrete and steel, which have a very high carbon footprint, about 10 times higher than wood as structural materials. So that's a third thing that we need to think about in terms of an overall strategy for carbon storage across the globe. There's no real easy, proportionality or numbers to this that I'm aware of. I just read a draft IPCC report on this exact topic, and it too doesn't offer an easy solution. It basically says, do a good job of forest management and all these things, and that will help you. We're always going to have wild cards out there like fires and wind throw and flooding and so forth that give us these pulses of emissions.
Yeah.
But again, I think if we diversify the landscape, that's our best bet.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, it seems, we are going to be managing for timber regardless into the future. So it seems like we're going to have an abundant amount of newly growing forests. I guess I tend to lean towards we have a very small amount of old forests that, contain that stored carbon. And so I tend to lean more towards the process of, if we have the ability to put it into something that is an older, more mature forest, and if it's not currently being managed for timber management or whatnot, then we should do that.
I totally agree, and I think that's what we're seeing across the Pacific Northwest, particularly on federal lands, because we have the Northwest Forest Plan, which is basically saying that we need to continue to restore or to create old forests and old forest structure across most of that landscape. So that is pretty well locked in for a long time, and that gives us a good carbon reserve, I think. So it may then give us more flexibility on some of our private lands to do some other kinds of things, including timber production, because we are no longer producing much timber off of federal lands.
Yeah, but it's interesting because there was a historical book that I read that was looking at the Western Montana's forest, not Lolo.
Bitterroot?
Bitterroot, thank you, the Bitterroot National Forest, and they were looking at the history of that forest, management policies, and their annual allowable cuts. And what they found was that when the Forest Service would allow cuts, the economy was really thriving. And when they would bring their cut amounts down, their economies would really suffer. And so what you realized was that a lot of these wood economies, and therefore a lot of rural communities in forest areas, were really stringently tied to the amount that we allow to cut on federal grounds. And so it's, I worry. I do worry, but I think about it of what does that future look like if we're continuing to shift the proportion of our landscape to something that we don't actively want to manage for timber. And theoretically, the hope is that we're going to set it up that way so it will be in perpetuity, at least within our life cycles. What are we doing to those wood economies? What are we doing to those rural communities that rely on the Forest Service actually cutting for timber?
Well, I think that's already a done deal, Sean. We all know that many timber mills have closed throughout the western United States, but that's it's partly because of those restrictions, but it's also partly because of other economic factors, such as it's a lot cheaper to produce timber in the southern U.S. than it is in the West, and so it's a variety of social and economic causes, and so we just need to say, okay, where are we now? And how can we optimize this? I think one thing we can do with forestry is think about high quality forestry. Have greater value for wood products. Maybe plant a little bit more cedar in the right locations than planting everything in Douglas fir on the west side. So think a little bit more creatively. For whatever reason, the world of forestry has been very slow to change.
Yeah.
And I think that we've paid the price for that in some cases. But I do think that things like climate change are now getting our attention throughout the entire forest sector. And everybody is starting to realize that sustainable forestry is good for all of us. We just need to define what that means for each of these different type of landowners.
When you talk about migration of trees, because migration is a real thing, okay, they're not forest trees, ants that get up and walk away, but they do migrate, and what I would hypothesize is that migration occurred through natural disturbance processes, so that those systems are changing with the climate, and the pathways, the physical pathways for trees to migrate themselves through seed dispersal are no longer as strong as they used to be. To me, that seems like there's this natural call for assisted migration through that statement in of itself.
I agree completely. Yeah, again, we're not dealing with natural forest systems anymore. We're dealing with a very human affected and influenced system. So it's not real. It's not realistic to just let nature take its course. In the case of climate change, natural migration of species may not be able to keep up with the
Yeah.
change in environment that's going to occur because of the rapid increase in temperature. So that's not a very smart thing to do. So we need to thoughtfully intervene and take actions where we think they're appropriate and the risks are low enough to have a successful outcome.
Do you think we're going to see juniper extend its distribution into eastern Washington in a strong sense, not looking at like juniper dunes?
Yeah, no, that absolutely seems like a possible occurrence. Yes. Unfortunately, we'll probably also see some extension of some of the non-native species that go with those arid and semi-arid systems as well.
Well, Dave, I think we are sitting at about an hour and a half on this presentation, which is usually where we like to call it. And this has been an excellent conversation, an excellent discussion. And so I guess from myself and from all the landowners that are listening to this and people that are listening to this, thank you very much for coming out today. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Dave.
Well, you're very welcome. I certainly enjoyed our conversation, and we covered a lot of ground, and let's do it again sometime.